All right, good evening, everybody. Starting a little bit late today. Welcome to the in April meeting of the Transportation Advisory Board. My name is Issaquah. I'm the chair of this board at the moment, and I'd like to get started. We're calling the meeting to order at, what time is it? 6:07, running a little bit late. I'd like to start with the minutes, and I'm going to invite Tom to share some thoughts that he shared with me about the minutes, and I'll just suffice to say that rather than put forth the minutes for approval, there was a comment about maybe some rewording of the characterization of the separating the responses to the environmental board's comments and the substantive material that we discussed separate from the environmental board. And I was going to let Tom describe that. My only question to you is, do you have enough information to then redo it? I wanted him to summarize so that you would then have it on the record, and then you could go redo it and resubmit the next time we meet. Do you feel like based on his comments, you have enough to go on?
Yeah, I think so.
And by the way, I agreed with Tom's desire to separate those two issues. So then I'll go ahead and move on to public comment. Do we have anybody wanting to make public comment?
There's no one online.
No one online, and you're just observing?
I'm just observing.
Okay, great. Great. Well, that catches us back on time, and now we're at item 4, regular business, and we'll start with greenhouse gas emissions, and you can introduce yourself, and
Absolutely.
thanks for coming.
Before we get started, if I may, please,
Please.
just like to read you this letter. Transportation Advisory Board, dear Transportation Advisory Board, tonight I wish to tender my immediate resignation from the board as my health is declining and I must limit my available volunteer time to the basic passion that I've had since leaving active duty in 1993. The passion is helping veterans in any way I can. It has been an honor and a privilege to serve the city of Issaquah as a volunteer, both on the cemetery board, 12 years, and transportation advisory board, almost 4. Issaquah has been home to me since 1945, when I came home from Issaquah from California after World War II with my mom and my dad. I've seen many, many changes, some good, some not so good, in my almost 80 years here. Thank you, TAB members, for your support and camaraderie. I wish you all the best in everything you do for our city. Signed, David S. Wagner, U.S. Army retired combat vet. So I'm submitting this to the chair, and I will be leaving your midst. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this organization. My health is declining. I have a mass on my brain caused by Agent Orange. Right now, I'm functional, but the doctors tell me that's probably not going to be much longer. So it's time to focus on the stuff that I really, really want to do, the stuff that's deep in my heart, and that's helping veterans and travel a little bit. I'm going to scurry home and watch the rest of the M's game. They were ahead when I left home. I'm hoping they are still ahead when I get home. Thanks again. And I'm not disappearing from Issaquah. I'm just limiting the time. And I'd like to take this sign as a souvenir if I could. Probably put it on my desk at home. I really appreciate the time that I've spent here and all those huge things that we've learned about this city and the constant fixes that we have to do. You guys got a big job. I feel like I did when I was running track. I used to run the relay team, and you pass that baton, you know? So I'm passing that baton to the new folks who are coming on board and make us proud, do good. This is a wonderful, wonderful community, and we got to make it stay that way. Thanks again, and with that, I do.
Well, Dave, thank you. I didn't see this coming, and I appreciate that you
No
shared.
tears needed.
Tears.
What we do in the military is when one soldier falls, we pick up and we keep on going, and that's what you guys got to do. Thanks again.
Data revenue file.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, boy, he will be missed. I think the only thing he cares more about than transportation and bus drivers and transit and all that is veterans. So I'm not surprised that he's prioritized that, but that was a big shock. So I'm sure, yeah, he'll feel the same way. But I do appreciate him being direct and clear and letting us know what's what. A lot of lack of clarity there. So, okay. Well, I'm glad he interrupted us. That was very important. Let's come back to our business. And I'd like to turn it over to you guys.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all very much for having me here today. I know that we can kind of take our time with this topic, and we'll give grace around questioning and everything else. So my name is David Reedy. I am the Sustainability Coordinator with the City of Issaquah. I'm part of quite a small team here at the city working on implementing our climate action plan. I support the environmental board, who I know you've met with in the past. And I work on a range of different projects, everything from transitioning our fleet away from fleet of vehicles away from gasoline, to decarbonizing our buildings, greenhouse gas inventories, and a wide range of other projects. And here today, I get to come before you to talk about our most recent greenhouse gas inventory, and put that in the context of how are we doing related to our climate action plan implementation, and then also really focus in a little bit on what are the transportation emissions and how is transportation really playing a role within this greenhouse gas inventory. So with that, I will have a presentation, and so I will go through the presentation, and then at the end, I'm happy to take questions, comments, and we can dig into this a little bit more. So the purpose of today's presentation is to share the results of our 2022 greenhouse gas inventory with TAB. And I know we're in 2024. Unfortunately, it takes a long time to gather all the data for these inventories. And we were able to just finalize the inventory earlier this year. So we were really excited about that. It takes a lot of cities a lot longer than that to get these inventories out. We will be discussing the inventory findings and how they are impacting policies, programs, projects, and budgets. And then I can answer any questions related to the inventory. As a quick background on what we're really talking about when we're discussing greenhouse gas inventories, these inventories are meant to calculate, quantify, and assess both the community-associated greenhouse gas emissions and the government-associated greenhouse gas emissions and their sources, so that we can better understand where our emissions are coming from, and we can better direct our efforts to addressing those emissions, right? We completed our greenhouse gas inventory to really take stock of where our greenhouse gas emissions are at this point in time, to help us understand trends relating to our goals within the climate action plan, and to, again, influence some of those projects, policies, and goals as we move forward. It is important to note these greenhouse gas inventory methods are regularly changing. So our first one was in 2007. And in that time, the inventory methodology has changed a lot. And the methodology continues to change as we have better models, as we have better ways of calculating emissions or gathering information related to emission sources. Yeah.
Do you correct for the changes in the modeling over time? Right, so if you,
Like historical emissions?
yeah, so if you're changing the method of capturing your data and you're trying to look at trends, you have to account for that somehow, right?
Yeah.
So you do, it's in there, it's.
Yes and no. So what we've done with this most recent update is we're trying to get as close as we can to standardizing our methodology as we move forward, and so that we can make smaller changes as they occur. We have standardized through our 2017 emissions inventory. So for the last 3 emissions inventories that we've done, it was essentially the decision going all the way back to 2007 and updating all of the pieces that were left out at that time was going to be not quite the best use of our time and funds, and it was going to be pretty difficult. And so what we did was the 2017, getting back to 2017 was making sure that we have 5 years of and 3 emissions inventories of accurate, consistent data so that we can look at those trends. So the process, we did this in partnership with what's called the East Side Climate Partnership cities, Bellevue, Redmond, Issaquah, Mercer Island, and Kirkland. And we did this as a means to save some funds, to standardize our processes, and to make sure that we're leveraging each other's skills and knowledge. We contracted out with Cascadia Consulting, who is a really well-known regional and national consulting firm who does a lot of these greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And the 2022 inventory represents our 5th community-wide greenhouse gas inventory. Again, the first one was back in 2007. And our first government operations inventory. So we have no trend data related to our government operations emissions inventory since this was our first one. And as we do more of them, we'll get that trend information. And completing these greenhouse gas inventories directly completes some actions as laid out in the Climate Action Plan. Putting our emissions inventory in context, before we dive into the data, it's important to think about a few specific pieces, right? So between 2007 and 2022, Issaquah has experienced a lot of growth. There's been a big population increase. There's been a lot of businesses moving in. And with that growth comes more emissions. Additionally, 2022 was the first inventory since COVID-19. And so as we're specifically thinking about transportation, COVID-19 had a lot of impacts on those transportation emissions within the city of Issaquah. And so you will see in a minute that we saw a decline in vehicle miles traveled, but we're actually expecting an increase once we do our next greenhouse gas inventory as folks continue to get back into their cars and continue to their work from home situations. Additionally, inventories are based off of a wide set of best practices, and that ranges from direct activity reporting. So for instance, the exact amount of gasoline consumed by city vehicles, right? We have that direct number. And then models, thinking about, well, how many vehicle miles traveled are occurred in Issaquah in 2022. That's unfortunately not something we have that direct number. We haven't counted those exactly, and so we have to rely on these models that that build into kind of how those numbers have changed over the years. Additionally, there are some assumptions as well. So situations where there aren't quite good models or direct activity reporting, we did have to make some assumptions, and those were based off of best practices. Some top takeaways. Unsurprisingly, the largest sources of community-wide and government operations emissions were those associated with the built environment and transportation. So when we're thinking about built environment, that's energy use mainly associated with keeping the lights on or keeping a building heated, right? With transportation, it's mainly the emissions coming out of the exhaust of a vehicle, right? And we anticipated that those would be the largest sources of emissions. That's consistent regionally. King County has seen the same thing. Seattle has seen the same thing. Communities across the Pacific Northwest have really seen that. Built environment and transportation remain the largest sources of emissions. And they've been the largest sources of emissions in all of our past emissions inventories. As we've noticed that, it's confirmed that as we're looking to reduce our emissions in line with our climate action plan goals, we want to continue to focus our efforts on addressing those transportation and built environment emissions, right? If we want to reach our goals, that's where the biggest sources of emissions are, and that's where we need to be focusing our efforts. Additionally, to meet our ICAP targets, as you'll see, we have a long way to go, and that's going to require a lot of continued and expanded local, state, utility, and federal action. It's going to be the mix of all of these together that's going to help us reach those targets. You will also in a minute see that there was a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions between 2017 and 2022. And I did just want to call out ahead of time that a lot of that reduction came from improvements in the Puget Sound Energy electric grid. So as their electricity becomes cleaner, the emissions go down for us in the use of our electricity in our homes, in our commercial buildings. And so when you see that our 22 emissions drop a little bit, most of that does come from that utility grid. So now we get to dive into some of the charts. Here we have, this is our 2022 community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And so you can see in the yellowish orange color, that's all the built environment. So that's the emissions associated with our electricity use, our natural gas use, other fuels like propane. And then the purple is the transportation emissions. And the biggest chunk of that is our on-road vehicles, right? So 31% of our citywide community-wide greenhouse gas emissions really come from vehicles driving on our roads, right? As we look at that over 2017 to 2022, and this is where we're talking about the three inventories that have the same methodology, you can see that there was that drop in 2022. And again, a big piece of that was a reduction in the utility emission, although you'll see again in a minute, there was a reduction in vehicle miles traveled as well. Yes.
Questions, one on the prior slide.
Sure.
Refrigerants. So what is the source of emissions for refrigerants? Because, I'm thinking refrigerants should be in a closed loop system. Is it accidental releases, that sort of stuff, or is it something else about?
Yeah, so it's accidental releases. It's the use of those refrigerants will actually release some gases like I believe some methane and things like that. And so all of that kind of goes into.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's 5%.
Yeah, surprised. So
Right? Seems like a lot.
Yes, it is a lot. And I think it's one of the sources that is more more recently being incorporated into greenhouse gas inventory. So again, if you look at our 2007 and 2020, 2007 and 2012 emissions inventories, refrigerants weren't included. And that's because this is one of those methodology changes as we're learning more about what are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Refrigerant use in buildings and in vehicles are starting to be incorporated more into these models.
And then the other question, and maybe it's in a later slide, but on this, so the built environment and transportation, is there something that breaks down between, like, I assume built environment is both like my home's heating and an office is heating and a grocery store's heating. And if you want to look at trends over time, you might expect that one of those is going to go up just based on population. The offices are probably getting most impacted by things like COVID. So is there that breakdown to see transportation? I see you have later, you have just miles for heavy duty, light duty, et cetera. But is there then that breakdown of the emissions to see like this type of graph, but with the X level of detail.
Like,
Yeah.
is this commercial?
Yes, there is. So there is more detail in the greenhouse gas inventory report that's on the website. And then even that, we have even more data that we didn't directly put into that written report, trying to think about what was going to be the most valuable for community reading. So we have, so there are some pieces that didn't even make it into that, but we have breakdowns of commercial, industrial, and residential energy use in the built environment, as well as, you know, the light duty, medium duty, heavy duty VMT and emissions associated with that, that vehicle miles traveled as well. So big question here as we worked through these slides and what we presented to council back in February was kind of what are the different slides and charts to show them. But yes, we do have all of that, and that helps inform different programs. So for instance, as we'll talk about later, we have programs targeted towards reducing energy use in residential buildings, and then we have programs targeted towards commercial buildings. And so each of the different programs is tailored towards more specific emissions and more specific audiences. So as I was discussing here, the 2022 emissions did drop, which is excellent, right? And our per capita emissions dropped, which is excellent. However, when we look at where we need to go, we have a long way to go, right? So the 2022 emissions inventory is the third line on the left, and our 2020, 2030 and 2050 goals, as you look out, are quite a bit lower, right? And so as we think about where we need to go, we have to continue to drastically reduce emissions, and we need to, the reduction between 2019 and 2022, we need that trend to continue, and we even need to accelerate that trend, right? When we look closer at transportation, there was a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 2022, and I did update the graph that was in the report, and I can send the updated slides to John to share out. But we have a target in the climate action plan to reduce our VMT by 20% compared to 2017. In 2022, we actually saw increases in heavy duty and medium duty VMT, right? We did see a decrease in light duty by 6%, which is nothing to sneeze at, but we still have a lot of ways to go between 2022 and 2030. And most folks are expecting that when we do the next greenhouse gas inventory, the light duty miles traveled will actually increase as more people were coming out of COVID, as more people were driving places, as remote work was becoming less common, or people were asked to come into the office more. Another note on the VMT, the city of Issaquah, our VMT was calculated based on a Puget Sound Regional Council model that looked at vehicle miles traveled within different blocks of space. And so this is really accounting for all of the vehicle miles traveled within the borders of the city of Issaquah, right? So this isn't counting, say, you driving from your home up to Bellingham, or, you know, a trip from Seattle to Ellensburg, but this is counting based on a model, all of the miles traveled across I-90 from, you know, the east side to the west side of Issaquah, right? And that's generally consistent. That model was used also for Mercer Island. Unfortunately, for us at least, Bellevue, Kirkland, and Redmond have an even better vehicle miles traveled model that they got to use, called the BKR model. Yes.
So question, for example, if you're going from Bellevue to Ellensburg, it's going to count that car when it's into the border.
Absolutely. Yeah. Additionally included in our transportation emissions, right, is regional trends with electric vehicles and the average miles per gallon of the cars that are used in our region. So all of that data gets aggregated and put into our software to help transition numbers like vehicle miles traveled to actual emissions. When we take a look at our government operations, similarly, the biggest sources of emissions come from our buildings and then transportation. One of the biggest surprising pieces to me was our employee commute actually accounts for 25% of our government operations emissions. And that is counting, from an employee's house to the city of Issaquah, right? Electricity use, natural gas use in our buildings still is almost 50% of our emissions. And then the emissions associated with our vehicles is almost 20%. The biggest users in our vehicles, the biggest emissions from our vehicles really come from our police and our utility maintenance vehicles. Those are the ones that drive the most distances. Those are the ones that are on the most. A lot of our vehicles, we're the city of Issaquah, we're not that big. A lot of our vehicles don't actually go very far.
So we need to talk about reducing the police side of the vehicles as far as instead of driving SUVs, driving a smaller four-cylinder.
There are many conversations around future police vehicle, what those are going to look like. Can we electrify those? There's a whole host of challenges because a lot of those vehicles are taken home at night, right? And so thinking about electrifying those is there's a number of different challenges to overcome there. But we're working pretty closely between myself and our fleet manager, and then the rest of our administrative services team and the police to think about options for reducing those emissions. When we think about addressing our emissions, right, we have a whole host of different projects and programs, and this board and the transportation team fit right on in there. As we think about reducing emissions from transportation, part of that is, more work that I'm associated with, such as supporting EV charging infrastructure and supporting the transition to electric vehicles. But it's also about supporting public transit, getting people out of their single occupancy vehicle cars through programs like Metro Flex, or by updating Title 18 so that we're building a more walkable, bikeable Issaquah, so people don't have to drive necessarily everywhere. Additionally, this is where I was mentioning before, we have specific programs such as Energy Smart Eastside, which targets decarbonization of residential buildings through the switch out of gas-powered furnaces for energy efficient electric heat pumps. We also have programs like the Clean Buildings Incentive Program, which is more focused on those commercial buildings and supporting them at reducing both their energy use as well as the electrification of those facilities. On the government side, we have also a whole host of programs looking at our own facilities. We are looking at how do we transition our fleet vehicles to electric or alternative fuel vehicles. John actually gets to run our commute trip reduction program. And so that's another way to address that 25% of our emissions, which comes from the employee commute. And so really trying to think about all of these programs as a bundle are how we're thinking about trying to get to the reduced ICAP targets. Yes.
How are we making sure we're avoiding the incentive problem? Like with the commute thing, you could just say, well, I'm gonna have my entire team be remote. Look how much I helped, right? But that's not the goal. The goal is different. So how are there checks that are being put in place? Like
checks to make sure that.
Another example, you could say, I'm only gonna hire people that live within a mile of City Hall.
Yes.
Right, but that'd be the wrong thing to do. Right, because we want to represent, love for people that work in our city to represent, all of the city and maybe even beyond the city. So what are the things to make sure that, like, is that conversation ever come up? Is it?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'll say that, the ICAP targets and thinking about, say, employee commute, that doesn't play any role in our hiring. or in.
I'm not actually worried about that.
Okay. I was gonna say, don't worry about that.
Explain
Um,
what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, so I would say that for the most part, all of these programs, nothing is happening in a vacuum, right? So everything that we're working on trying to get our emissions reduced, we're having all of the conversations with the different departments who have their own goals, right? You know, so in terms of thinking about employees working from home, for instance, that just doesn't work for some of the departments, right? And so it's not going to be necessarily our space to think about, well, try it anyways. But instead it's, okay, if that doesn't work for your team, maybe hybrid is not the situation that works for them. What are the other ways we can support that team for reducing their commuting emissions? And maybe that's carpooling, maybe that's installing the EV infrastructure so that an employee can better charge an electric vehicle and they're at work, and therefore make that transition in their personal lives easier, right? So it's going to be kind of the mix and of measures, and then also those conversations with community members, staff, different departments as well, to really try and tailor the solution to each situation.
Jumping off of that point, or one of those conversations, does the city offer like free or reduced oral cards to the employees? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yes, we do.
How many employees does the city have?
It's 270 something or something like that.
Yeah, I was gonna guess 260. It's
something.
around the 260 to 70 range.
How do we compare to other cities?
That's a good question. Emily, do you know the answer to that question?
Very similar. I mean, it's hard to look at just city level because there's so many things you have to take into consideration. It's a full service city.
Yeah.
The water departments. But that to apples to apples.
One of the things we did look at, and again, it's in the full report, is this is on the government operations side, but looking at the emissions from our government operations on a per employee basis, so per FTE. And we're higher than some of the other east side cities who participated in this project, which is not surprising, right? If you work in Bellevue, you have more options to take public transit to work, right? Than you do if you work in Issaquah. However, I think we were similar to Kirkland, maybe Redmond. Actually, I think we were similar to Kirkland, and then Mercer Island, Bellevue, and Redmond were lower than us.
Like, it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sammamish was in there.
Sammamish was not in there, although they are going to be I believe now a part of the Eastside Climate Partnership. So in the future, they'll start doing things like greenhouse gas inventories alongside us. Just real quick, talking about next steps. We are partnering with departments across the city, and this again goes to the point of we're not doing anything in a vacuum here. So we're discussing the results. We're talking about ways that we can address different sources of greenhouse gas emissions and leverage these results for budget requests and projects and policies right across the city. We will be using this data to inform an ICAP midpoint check-in with council, which is going to happen in a couple months. So we'll be reporting to city council on how are we doing reaching our many targets and goals laid out in the climate action plan. We do intend to do another greenhouse gas inventory for our current year, 2024. So that process will begin in 2025. And then we'll actually be updating the climate action plan in 2025 and 26. And so the next greenhouse gas inventory, as well as this one, will be informing that update process as we think about how do we want to change our actions? How do we want to change our framing of things? Do we need to make updates to our goals, right? All of that gets to kind of feed right into that update process in about a year or 2 years. And with that, I'm happy to have any other questions, discussions. If there's any questions on the whole presentation, happy to answer them.
What is, so like the, like small, like 2%, I think, for, like government, or it was a little more government, but 2% for community for landfill, what is, what, like, we don't have a landfill here, I guess, is that just waste that comes from the community or the government and like off gases or what? Yeah.
Yeah, so great point. So for the city waste, well, actually, it's city and community wide. We can measure the greenhouse gas emissions mainly through like methane releases and things like that from the landfill, based on the amount of tonnage of our both residence, commercial, and then city operations that are going to specifically, you know, Cedar Grove for composting, but then the landfills down south in Maple Valley. So we can, and there is actually very you know, luckily for us, there's very specific emissions data on each of the different waste facilities. So the kind of factors in calculating our emissions based on waste that went to our facility are different than, say, waste that goes to a facility up north, because the emissions associated with each facility are going to be different.
A couple questions, but I just want to see if anybody else had any, Jeremy.
So I was doing a little bit of reading about, you know, this modeling and all that. In terms of like, why is it that we weren't able to get the BKS?
BKR model?
Yeah. BKR.
My understanding is that model is specific to Bellevue, Kirkland, and Redmond. That's the BKR there. And that they were not planning on expanding that model for Issaquah and Mercer Island. So I don't have a great answer there, other than it was developed for those three cities, and we weren't a part of it so far.
Trademark it? Like we can't, like what? Like
it's specific to kind of how those cities are, how transportation is being measured within those cities. So it's not something that we can just kind of plug any numbers into. It's very specific to kind of like that geography. Yeah.
Purpose of modeling, it seems almost counterproductive to try and go to some proprietary method that you can't compare, can't track a stable over time. So you wanted it, but you proved it, right?
Yeah.
Keep changing. That was why I asked that question earlier.
Yes, and that speaks to some of the challenges, right? If we do this in 2024 and suddenly we're told, well, there's all these new methods, right? Then we have to make those decisions of what inventories do we update so we can have that better trend and analysis over time. You know, another big piece when we're thinking about these emissions inventories is that they're really not perfect. They're meant to show kind of a point in time best understanding of where we're at to help us drive forward, right? And so we should take all of our inventories, both at the city and of Issaquah and any other ones we look at, with a grain of salt, since again, they're best available methodologies at the time, and we'll adjust them as best we can.
Question, a couple questions. One is, I'm sure if I read the appendices and so forth, I
No
would find out
problem.
what
No
other
problem.
sources are, but I'm wondering about consumer, everything from food to
Awesome question.
I buy a pair of shoes, like I'm unsure what's not included in this.
Yes,
Not
so
that this is useful, but I'm just wondering about all the other things we might do.
yes, so there are exclusions. There is some explanation of that in the full report. The two big ones that I'll call out are consumption of goods, right? Okay. So again, like you buy a pair of shoes, the emissions associated with manufacturing those shoes and getting the resources to put those shoes together and transporting them to here. That is not that is not included in that. And that's those consumption-based inventories, they're called, the consumption is called scope 3 inventories. And those are, they haven't really been figured out how to best calculate those yet.
Hypothetically, if we had somebody making shoes in a building in that I ended up buying, like that would be, or that got sold anywhere, that would be included in the built environment in the facility.
Yes,
We have.
so all of the work that's happening at that facility would be included, right? The energy use, their, you know, their refrigerant emissions, their vehicles, right? All of that would be included. But say, you know, the growth of the fibers that are then making the shoe, or the plastics that are going into that are manufactured somewhere else, that is not accounted for. And that goes into also the challenges of making sure in inventories that you're not double counting emissions. So we're trying to to count what's happening in our city. And if you're counting what's kind of happening at a facility in Louisiana before a product gets to us, that provides challenges for making sure we're trying to have accurate. And so frankly, that's something that hasn't been fully figured out by the greenhouse gas inventory community yet.
Yeah, I can see how that double counting would be a problem. I just can't help but think that in more affluent communities, some of the consumption is just dramatically under.
Yeah.
But you would end up with a double counting problem. Yeah.
And I think that has come up quite a bit in our conversations. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's something that we try and tackle in the future. We just haven't quite figured out how to best tackle it yet.
So about the consumption and tackling that, one of the problems with, tackling the consumption side of it is that what's the best way to reduce emissions then? Increase poverty. I don't mean that as a serious suggestion we should try and increase poverty, but that's sort of once you get down that road, that's like the obvious answer. And it's, back to the perverse incentives. As far as just tracking it, I actually pretty firmly believe that it's not of value for what it's going to cost for Issaquah to go try and track consumption, because the city is not really going to have the ability to have an effect there unless we feel like we have all the resources we need to go and deal with this. Why go bite off something else when this is more within the scope of what the city can affect, right? So as long as there's room here, and this is where the dollar goes further, it seems like this is what you focus on.
That's a great point. And I'll say that was also part of the conversation, right? Is trying to think about where can we make a difference in our emissions, and trying to be critical of that as we're thinking about that. And so as we do our 2024 inventory in 2025, we'll work with our consultants and we'll work with the nearby cities to say, first off, what can we address? And really, what are the methodological updates that we might need to make at this time? And what are the options available for us?
I will, is there a way to possibly fairly roughly approximate those consumption? Because I know the federal agency collects economic data and you can actually look at it on a city level, I believe. Last time I was doing some research on that. So you can look at a city level, kind of do block 6, like
Census block.
Not census block, but like product categories, pretty specific product categories, like the total sales.
Of specific product categories within
Yeah.
census block?
Yeah, or not within census blocks, within the city. Cities. I believe it's actually collected by the states with their sales tax information. But is there a way to approximate, very roughly approximate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm not familiar with that specific tool. There are consumption-based emissions inventories and methodologies out there. Nothing that I'm particularly familiar with. I'll have to get back to you on kind of more specifics there. So it's not something that has never been done, and there are absolutely tools out there. It's not quite, it hasn't made it into the more mainstream greenhouse gas inventories yet.
Did you, yeah, can I ask what, so I know you've had to go back and update some of the, there was a decision made to not to go back and update all of the studies from 2007 and onward into, in the interest of time, but like what consistencies are there? Like, did you use the same consulting group or it sounds like this wasn't part of the methodology, but like if you're using like testing sites where they in the same spots or something like that, like.
Yes.
Or it's just all different across the board.
Oh, it's a great question. So the first two inventories we did were done in-house, 2007 and 2012. No consulting firms. We had staff who just did them themselves. With our 2022 inventory, that was done with Cascadia Consulting, and they were the ones who, using the methodology we used for 2022, updated both 2019 and 2017, right? So they were the ones who, so that is consistent across the board in terms of methodology and based on the consulting firm who did that. Additionally, 2019 was actually done as a regional inventory. So there's this great tool you can use where you can kind of click down through King County cities, and every single city has its own inventory, which many cities, that was their first inventory, or they haven't done one since, right? Because it does take resources, effort, and time to do these. So Cascadia was actually the one who did that regional inventory as well. And so they were really familiar with all of that data and were able to make sure that our 2017, 2019, and 2022 data was consistent with that, and then also kind of update that process as well. And then I will say the intention is to continue along with the same methodology and firm for our next inventory update. With some House bills that have passed, there's talk of kind of regional, statewide inventories and what that looks like. Cascadia Consulting is very involved with that at the state level. And so it's a fast evolving space. And so our intentions now might change depending on how situations shake out in a year.
Did you say the next one would be?
It would be a 2024 inventory, so we would probably start in 2025.
Okay, so it's a back, yeah. So my other question is kind of a broad one. It kind of gets a little bit to your point, and that's just, not even exactly sure how about this question, but aside from the obvious, I mean, you want to measure because you want to see how we're doing. Like, what are the goals overall? And I also think it's really interesting that the city is 1% of the total of community-wide emissions, but it has its own thing. And it seems like there's a inverse relationship. In that case, you have a lot of control, just not a lot of impact, but you have a lot of control. Is there also like modeling, and not the kind of model we make a model, but like demonstration, I guess is a better word. And so like, I guess like, if I had a better, I'm really interested in hearing you articulate maybe a nuanced version of what the goals are and what some of the trade-offs are when you're trying to decide what to measure and what to invest in when you're measuring, and things that we can impact and things that we just want to know.
Yeah. So it's a great question. And so the first bit, I'll put this up. This is really our, what I would say is kind of the driving goal of the climate action plan, right? So we are, the climate action plan is sets target for us to reduce our emissions 95% by 2050 and 50% by 2030, right? And so by doing these inventories, we're hopefully trying to get a sense of where are we in relation to that goal, right? So that's the driving target of why we're doing these. When we're thinking about what projects to pursue, where to put our money, right? I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the challenge of thinking about our city emissions are you know, they are a small part of our community-wide emissions. However, as you noted, we have the most control over those, right? We can decide whether or not we are putting solar panels on our roof or changing out a vehicle. Those are our operations, right? So we have a lot of control over that, and we're working with each of those teams, right? Our facilities team, our fleet team, our IT team, our public works team, regularly to talk about what are the ways that we can address the different emission sources based on their work or their facility or something like that, right? For the community side, it's a challenge, right, to try and help us get to these targets. And that's where it kind of comes in from both state, local, utility, federal level, thinking about the ways we can put incentives and regulations on to support reaching these targets. And so there are state programs like the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which is going to mandate an entirely clean energy electric grid, right? And so that's going to be reducing all of the emissions associated with electric use. However, as we electrify our buildings and we have a more clean energy driven electric grid, we still need to be thinking about just energy efficiency because we don't want to continue to strain the grid, right? So there's all sorts of different pieces that are going into kind of the community-wide projects and goals and thinking about how to best address those emissions. And so it's a mix of regulations, incentives, education, right? Trying to make sure that people are aware of the different tools that they can use. Does that help get at your question?
So in case of the refrigerate, the 5% refrigerate, what measures are being taken? Because that number expected to increase, I believe, with global warming, with temperature increasing. What are the measures taken there to control that? Because that's expected to grow.
Yeah, so with the refrigerants, there's different, it's something that different facilities and builders and things are looking at more. So there's different types of equipment that can be installed, different types of refrigerants that can be used in equipment to reduce those emissions. So
do we have historical, like previous numbers for that?
we have refrigerant data through 2017. For our city operations, this was our first year, so we have no historical data there.
Okay, was it lower? Was it higher?
This year compared to the community-wide? That is a good question. It was roughly the same. So that's that green bar on the top of, or that green row on the top of those columns.
So thinking about the 5% of our total emissions is the target in 2050. That seems preposterous. Like, I mean, you're basically, you have to game the system and how you track things. And then you get into the measuring the Norway fjords issue, right? The closer you, the smaller the increment you measured in, the larger the number gets. And so to me, like sitting here, transportation board, I don't really care about this. I care about the transportation side of it and what's the target for transportation and setting a target that is achievable but lofty, right? And so like when I look at that and I go like, well, okay, to get that, you have to get basically every single category all the way down. And that just seems you're going to be, you could, if I go sell my gas car and I buy an electric car, and someone who normally took the bus but lives in Bellevue, they're like, I can now afford a car. I'm going to go buy a car. So they buy my used car. They drive around. Well, guess what? Our emissions in Issaquah went down. I'm driving an electric car now, but Bellevue went up. So this is where like 5%, because this is a collective thing, right? I mean, if Issaquah is the only person doing this, only city, then it wouldn't actually do anything, right? Everyone has to do their part. So it just seems 5% seems like
The 95%
Yeah,
reduction.
95% reduction, so down to 5. And then I think the other piece of that is I'm very curious on like, if we were to look at just the transportation side of it, miles is one thing, but we know a light duty truck and a heavy duty truck are very different. Right? So like, what's like the transportation focus? And I don't expect that I can answer right here, but I think that's what I'd be curious about for our board is if we just said, let's look at what's kind of within our scope.
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. The general goals, they were developed through the adoption of the Climate Action Plan in 2021. And they are consistent with what's called the King County Cities Climate Collaborative. So these are goals that have been adopted and committed to by cities across King County.
King County loves to come up with goals that are just any person look at it and go, that's not gonna happen. So that's, I'm very curious on if we were to look at a transportation element, what would be a goal for us to set? Because I think not a setting, but us to keep in mind and what can we do on our portion.
Yeah, and I think to that, right, we have goals specifically within the climate action plan that are meant to help us get to the overall emissions reduction, right? So for instance, one of the ones here is that reduction in vehicle miles traveled because, right, as we reduce overall vehicle miles traveled, we're going to reduce our emissions, right? There's another one in the climate action plan to improve or reduce the rate of single occupancy vehicles, right? And so again, all of that is related to how can we get vehicles off the road really, or reduce those emissions from vehicles to help us reach our climate action goals. And we have more targets in there. I think this is just showing 2030, but there are some farther goals too. Like there's an even stronger, I would say, vehicle miles traveled goal as well, right? And so I think you're absolutely right. As we take these kind of bigger numbers, we can kind of dive into them more deeply to think about, okay, so for reducing transportation emissions, that's reducing the vehicle miles traveled, it's improving the use of electric and other alternative fuel vehicles, right? It's improving our community so that people can walk places and bike places and take public transportation. And it's a mix of all of those pieces together that are that's gonna get that piece of the pie as low as possible so that we can work towards those goals we've set out for us in 2030 and 2050. And you are absolutely right. They are very ambitious and are going to be very, very hard to reach.
So a couple of comments I have. One is I went to American Public Works a year ago, and this guy was giving a talk about you buy a car and just use the numbers $2,000 or 2,000 pounds is the weight of the car. So a gallon of gas to move that car. So you lose about 30% in efficiencies, heat loss and stuff like that. So really 0.7% or 70% of that gallon moves you. Then a person will save their way 200 pounds or 2,000 pounds, 10 for that. So that's 0.07% of that gallon of gas is used to move the person driving a car from somewhere. You put in perspective of that, take that much gas, and that much is used for moving you, and the rest is all waste. Moving the weight of the vehicle, the heat loss. It's like, wow. So it's a loss. And so think about that when you look at vehicle miles traveled, if you grow, vehicle miles probably is not going to change that much. And if everybody goes to electric cars, the actual emissions would go down, but you have to take into account all the other dams, power plants, coal plants, all the other plants producing electricity. Their pollution and their contribution is going to be included in the prediction or in the forecast of what Issaquah does. So in a way, it may not ever go down because its energy still has to be created.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And luckily that energy is incorporated. So when we look at the emissions associated with the fuel sources for our vehicles, there's emissions factors for natural gas or for gasoline, for diesel, right? And those emissions factors change based on the class of vehicle, right? So those heavy duties have a higher emissions factor than those light duty vehicles. Similarly with electric vehicles, right now we can look at the consumption of electricity used to power vehicles, right, that are traveling through Issaquah. And we can look at the energy intensity of the electric grid that vehicle is drawing from. So right now, PSE has been improving their grid, but it's not the cleanest grid in the world. And so those emissions are calculated within the consumption of electricity within these models. Now, they're still reducing, even pulling from PSC's electric grid, it's still a lot less emissions than gasoline or diesel, right? However, that's where some of those other state laws come into play, and also the actions of improving distributed renewable energy generation and things like that. So as the PSC electric grid becomes cleaner and more renewable energy is added onto that, then the emissions associated with the electricity consumed in vehicles will reduce.
Some of the wind turbines, I mean, that's almost such a small percentage part. And if you look at the average clean electricity, but you're also creating a lot of heat storage and water.
Yeah.
You also or down more dams. Tear down all the dams, let the fishermen build nuclear power plants.
Yeah. There is a current law that is mandating 100% clean energy.
But it's, so the other thing would be look at, and maybe the bigger picture that's be able to tackle them, but instead of people having 8-cylinder cars, have a 4-cylinders, cut emissions. There's some other things to do besides just electrifying cars and.
Absolutely. Another thing that a lot of cities are looking at and thinking about are what are the opportunities for bikes or electric bikes, right? If you're thinking about, maybe you don't want to bike from the valley floor of Issaquah up to Issaquah Highlands, if that's where your job is with a regular bike, but maybe if it's an electric bike, you would actually bike to work, right? And so there are many cities, both regionally and nationally, that are trying to look at, well, what are those other options, right? Not just electrifying cars, because we don't really want to necessarily only incentivize people to keep driving, but just in electric cars. But how can we pull people out of cars through bikes or public transit or, walkable community, right?
So.
I do not, yes.
Go ahead.
I was with biking, like
Yes.
something that I thought about, because I considered biking here myself. Different things change, whatever, weather's not so great. I also don't feel super confident riding a bike through Gilman or city streets, things like that. Even if I'm trying to use the best route possible that incorporates trails and things that a little bit less scary for someone less confident than me. So I don't know what the city can do to I don't even classes for people who are to just get more confident biking, right? I'm a confident trail neighborhood biker, but not a city biker.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and definitely something that we can chat about. I think when we speak to where does the Transportation Advisory Board fit in, and where does our transportation team fit in addressing our emissions, it's pieces like that. How can we make our streets safer for bikers, right? That'll help us reduce our emissions, right? How do we make sure that there's sidewalks and other ways that people can walk around, right?
Good one too, also as far as electric bikes, as far as trying to remove cars and having people being able to bike up.
Yeah.
By an electric bike.
You don't need a costume change when you get to the top of the hill if it's electric. I do think that we want to start thinking about wrapping up. Does anybody have any burning questions or comments before we wrap? I feel like I just want to say that you obviously know this material really well. I think you've done a great presentation. I really appreciate it. And I think the level of engagement is quite high, which is, and we probably stay here for another hour and have a very engaging conversation, but we probably should continue on our business at hand.
Absolutely. And I'd say I'm happy to answer questions after the meeting. You can send me questions. I'm more than happy to continue to engage with this topic. I do really appreciate the engagement y'all have had. It's been very interesting. And definitely has given us more things to continue to think about as we move forward with this. So I appreciate it very much.
I didn't know that all this was being done. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Well, with that, should we move on to 4B, traffic calming? And looks like we've got some of these to share. Do we have just 3 of them?
Yeah, I printed out 3, one for each area.
Got it, okay.
Trying to save some paper. Yeah, thank you.
That's right.
That's coming up. Yeah.
Hope that, I have one more meeting I have to miss this year. I hope it's not that one.
I don't think that one's been scheduled yet, so. Hi, all right, let's talk about traffic calming. I am John Larson Friend, Transportation Program Coordinator. Talking about the traffic calming policy and more specifically, the procedure structure that we've been working on for the past, I don't know, year and a half. So I can actually move around, there we go. So the purpose of this evening's presentation is to receive feedback on questions the administration has concerning the traffic calming policy and procedure restructure. The direction needed this evening is we're requesting feedback on the following topics: program objectives, plan initiation, and plan support. That'll make more sense in a few minutes. The agenda is broken down into 4 parts, looking at the existing traffic calming policy. That will be very quick. We've already done that. And then looking kind of at the history of the new traffic calming program development. We'll take a look at the draft traffic calming program that we've developed, structure, I should say. And then we have a few feedback questions that we're looking for feedback on. So very quickly, the existing traffic calming policy, as we've talked about, these will be repeat slides for the most part. Adopted in 2003, addresses local streets, AKA residential streets. The process is currently broken into 2 phases. Phase 1 is kind of non-physical. Phase 2 is physical if those standards are met during the non-physical process. The original traffic calming program had a citizen action request form that people would walk into City Hall and ask for. They would be given a brochure, and then staff would do traffic analysis and field review, largely based upon the 85th percentile, which I talked about, I think, extensively last time I was here talking about this. And then there was that neighborhood speed watch program, which we don't want to talk about that. And then there was a 6-month evaluation period.
I'm just gonna stop you just to
Yes.
make sure that everybody, even if you said it 10 times, it is a very specific thing. Does everybody know what he's talking about, the 85th percentile? Anybody? Okay, cool. I'm hearing no.
Cool. Okay. So then moving into phase 2 is that physical actual traffic calming device analysis. Staff would go through that process using the data that they collected, determining which of the, it was like 8 different traffic calming devices that were in the policy would be appropriate. Mail a survey out to this neighborhood. If the neighborhood says yes, install it, and there'd be a 1-year evaluation. Looking at why we're re-looking at the traffic calming policy. So these days it's done, the reporting is done virtually. There's no brochures, no like extra language around it or anything like that given out to the public. Besides, I think there's a website, a web page on the city webpage. There's also lack of resources in general, but specifically for speed trailer deployment, which is it's a big part of the data collection process that we go through. And then since I took it over in 2022, we haven't made it to phase 2, although that might not be true anymore as of a couple of weeks from now. We'll see. We might have one that might actually qualify. So been through all that. So a little bit of history on how we've gotten to this moment. So this is not the first or second or third or fourth or fifth time that the TAB has gotten this particular topic. So this topic was first introduced to TAB, the concept of rewriting the traffic calming program as a part of the MMP, the Mobility Master Plan process. It was packaged with the Complete Streets Policy and Pedestrian Crossing Guidelines. Those 2 were created and implemented, and traffic calming was sort of going to be the tail end of that process. 2019, I think it was Stephen, came before the TAB and said, hey, we're working with a consultant. We're going to continue working on it in 2022. And then early 2020, 2020, and then into early 2020, there was an estimated adoption of summer 2020. And then something happened somewhere in there and kind of pushed all those projects off. And later in 2020, basically traffic calming was officially pushed to 2021. And then late 2021, I think Isabel came and talked about the work that they had been doing with the consultant. And that brings us to this thing, which she presented in some way. So basically, this was the work that was done with the consultant. And I'm not going to get into this deeply, but I just want to highlight that plan initiation, plan development, plan support, and plan implementation, that structure is something that we have taken forward. The individual elements have changed quite a bit since then, but we'll get into that more specifically. More recently, I took over the program in fall 2022, worked on the update in 2023, reintroduced you to it late last year, and now we're here. So before we get into the actual questions and structure, just wanted to highlight what the next steps for this project are, since there have been many steps leading up to this point. So the plan is going into May, drafting an official draft of the new traffic calming policy. June 2024 of this year, we're going to be doing some mostly internal stakeholder review. We're also going to give it to Eastside Fire, the school district, kind of those types of stakeholders within the community area, and go through. We're going to give them the draft, and they're going to go through it and scrutinize it and give us all their notes, and we're going to take that feedback and make it work for as many parties as possible. July, hopefully, if everything goes well, we'll come back to TAB for review and approval. And then the fall, we'll be taking it to Mobility and Infrastructure and City Council. So, looking at the draft traffic calming program. This is what I have printed out in front of you. Feel free to reference it. I know it feels like a spider web. I promise it's not. I will get into the individual sections here in a second. I wanted to give you an overview of sort of what we're thinking about. The best way to read it is green arrows are go ahead to the next section. Red is basically the project has reached a point where it's going to be eliminated for whatever reason. And then yellow, you don't have to worry too much about this. This will come in when I actually have the actual draft for you. But we have developed a 3-tiered system of traffic calming elements that can be escalated to if it seems like the first iteration is working and the next iteration will work better. Don't worry too much about that at this point, but yeah, if you have any questions about it later, we can talk about it. Okay, getting into the actual structure. And I've added a little roadmap in the corner too, so you can follow along. So basically, section 1 is plan initiation. So the process would go, there would be a resident or a group that would submit a petition request directly to the city. Staff would look at the request and look at the outlined area, assuming that it's a specific street, probably with homes or residences lining it. We would give those petition requirements back to the petitionee, and they would go out and collect signatures from at least 50% of households in that area that we've outlined. Minimum of 5. So if there's 5 homes, we have to get 5 signatures and going up from there. Once they submit that, it would become a first come, first served system. So we put them in the stack, and then we would go through a project selection process. Staff would identify the number of projects that could be addressed in a given year based on the budget and staff resources, very similar to the CIP, TIP process. And then we would notify the parties of the status of their project. Yes,
There's no time limit for the like signature collection.
no,
Okay. So
not at this point, no.
theoretically, I could like get my, like, get the petition, canvass the neighborhood over like 10 years.
I mean, theoretically, I guess. I guess it's something we could probably look at.
Not too worried about that, but
I mean,
Should be a very.
I would assume that everyone, all the neighbors would have to be present.
I'll just,
Yeah, I think this just outlines the basic bones, right, of the
Yeah.
procedure. The policy will probably address some of those.
Yes, thank you. So we believe that this new first section would be more resident focused. We want it to be a little bit more holistic. And then staff can also evaluate capacity each year. Section 2, plan development. So once that petition has made it into the queue and basically approved by staff to move to the next section, there would be a notice to the neighborhood to basically let them know that we intend to create this traffic calming plan for the specific area. We go through a period of data collection, go through, traffic data on neighborhood streets. We would develop an internal process to make sure that kind of each foreseen circumstance would go through a specific type of process. So if someone has a certain stretch of road and they're requesting traffic calming of some kind, we would have a process for that type of circumstance, and we would have those going down. Those could either be divided into by traffic calming device or whatnot. We'll figure that out in the future. We would also then go on to solicit input from local service providers. So looking at, fire department, police department, transit agencies, school districts, other city departments. We really want to ensure collaboration across as many sectors as possible so that it could be a holistic process. A final draft of the plan would be drafted. And then that would move into section 3, which is plan support. So this model really reinforces the desire to have neighborhood and resident inclusion in the process. So there would be another survey that would go out to the neighborhood residents, business owners if applicable, and there would be a tally of neighborhood support based on this survey. Yes.
Why only neighborhood support? Why not users of the road support? Why are they not considered? I mean, you could have a situation where the neighborhood are 1% of the people that use the road. People, in some cases, literally chose a house because of the convenience of getting onto the highway. And they're like, well, I want to make it so it's slower for the people that come through here. Well, what about the people that actually drive through there?
I would say A, it would be really hard to engage those people specifically. And B, since these are residential streets specifically, these aren't even collectors at this point, that it's highly unlikely that the majority users wouldn't be the residents.
If that's true, if B is true, then can't that at least be measured as part of the project, like validating are the majority users actually people that live in the area? Are you being representative of the people affected by it by only canvassing the neighborhood?
I mean, I would say, like, when we're talking about these residential streets, I think one of the major things that, people come to us and talk about is like wanting to slow down the traffic, pass through traffic on their streets. And they're always concerned about the speeding or whatever. They're always concerned with safety there. And so I think that this is just on the residential streets.
So they want to potentially severely negatively affect 99% of people using that road for 5 people's benefit. It's not necessarily going to be the case often, but I think at least there should be some measure of who's using that road. some sort of check that, okay, it's classified as a neighborhood road. Are the users actually people that live there? So if you're doing a survey, because I think I would hope we would all agree that if you're making a change to something, you should gather the input of the stakeholders in that thing. And the stakeholders in that thing aren't necessarily, majority the people that happen to live by that road.
Flip side of that is like, if I live in a neighborhood and happen to be using the arterial road. And like everybody, I'm thinking of Old Town where they've done some of this and everybody kind of knows everybody on that street. And you know who the passerbys are. And they're just cheating, trying to get to the other light to find a quicker way to get to Issaquah Harbor Road, where they'll be backed up the next hour. And so going to the neighborhood, so the neighbors would kind of have an idea of who's going to the neighborhood, I would think. I think that part would be, and you may not know unless you do it as an next survey of where it's going from. It's actually going down, but that.
I'm sure if you drill down within these streets, you'll find examples that are like, we're picturing a very neighborhood street, and we'll find examples where we're picturing a neighborhood street and it's really not quite like that. And I mean, as you say, the people driving down the road, the roads are paid for by the collective. So my input, it doesn't mean
Yeah,
that it's
that's very-
a universal input. It's just my input that I think that there should be some sort of a check or some thought process in here on, because everything is, we're just basically saying, like the people that residents or business owners that are off that road. Is there any sort of a check to, well, what about the people using the road? Are we doing anything to think about that?
I would say that, and I'll let you chime in after. For me, I believe in looking at and managing this program. The main stakeholders of this type of program are the residents and businesses in a certain stretch of road. So.
Yeah, I was just gonna make the same point. City council has been abundantly clear. It's meant to serve. I would also differentiate on what the intent of this survey is. This survey is at the point in time plan. So we have a recommendation on what to install, what engineering fix, shall we say, enhancements we want to make on the road. And so the intent, this survey, is to share that with the residents. They're going to have to live with that change and create that level of awareness, and also check to make sure that that is something that they can accept. Some of us have worked in communities that have installed and uninstalled. For example, because community members weren't consulted after the plan was developed, or they just didn't have a good sense of the noise and other implications. So this is one way for us to check first before we make the investment, and to make sure that we're prioritizing this work. Desired.
I was just kind of thinking about, I don't know if this is the right time to give this comment, but just it kind of echoes a little bit different spin on what you're talking about. But it looks to me like you get all the way to the bottom of the third column before it's not entirely community driven with no other policy input. And it seems like, and maybe this is just shorthand and it's in there somewhere, but at some point earlier on, maybe evaluating whether or not there's the transportation professionals think that it suits the network. Like, is there any other, so it's kind of another way of saying what you're saying,
I
which
think
is
you're
like,
thinking of a much better way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
like a reality, like it's this, does this makes.
Yeah, if you asked me what I wanted to do on the road in front of my house, I might give an answer that's not the best answer when we look at the bigger picture.
And
Yes.
the answer to that would be, I went back to section 2, we have given ourselves an off ramp there in the form of. Yeah, it is.
What I was
It is-
looking for, where's the offering?
So it's 2B, the orange.
That's just saying if the data that's collected isn't meet the standard.
Right, after we collect the data, does it seem like there's an issue that could be resolved with traffic calming? And then there's this assessment between, I would say, 2B, 2C as we get input, leading into 2D, where we provide that sort of technical review. What's the appropriate fix for the problem that we're seeing here? And how might it affect other things, the network, public safety, all of that?
We can make that clear.
I would love to see that more explicit.
Yes, absolutely.
Like,
Yeah.
So in that case, for example, what a classification of road, and for example, you were saying, if people kind of did this neighborhood, and neighbor said, hey, we want to go put people down, and it's not a smaller residential road, but it's a residential road, but it's actually becoming more of a throwaway. The classification of that road, and as it goes to this, would there be some discussion as far as, well, actually the function of that road is going to change because the way that people are. So maybe the traffic calming would not then change on that road, actually might be something else they do to the road, to make it more.
Yes.
functional.
Yeah, that would certainly go into the engineering aspect of the process. Yeah. Yeah. Okay,
thanks.
all really good thoughts. I appreciate it.
It comes back to, I had another question, like on the
Yeah.
first one, where it's on a first come, first serve.
Which I have a question about it later, so maybe
Yeah.
I'll get through this and then we'll, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
There was a question about that. Okay, so, 7:30. So the neighbor, so basically we would have this survey that would go out, get approval. Minimum response rate of 50%, approval rate of 65%. Those numbers came directly from the consultant. Those are industry standards, I believe, for something like this. And then it would be put into either the CIP, TIP, or a small projects bundle bucket, as we've been calling it. And that's based on the cost of the project. CIP, TIP would be those bigger ones. The small projects, we have other buckets like this. We have like road maintenance. We have one that, projects fall into, something similar to that. And then it would go to council, just like a CIP, TIP process would go to council for approval.
So one question on that, when it goes to council and they say no, that just stops, as opposed to going to go back and say, no, this is not good, but if you look at this, we consider it, where we go back then to one of the other steps in the process, pick it up.
Under this draft, yes, but there's certainly room to discuss what that might look like if, no?
I would say the reality
Oh,
is,
that's
when council considers an item, it can be yay, it can be nay, it can be something in between. They could send it back to staff to come up with different alternatives. So anything's possible. Great.
That's a way better answer than I had. Okay, moving on to section 4. This is the most straightforward part of this plan. Find funding, get it installed, monitor it, and then once the monitoring has happened after 6 months, then basically next steps would be determined. The clover leaf down at the bottom there is a part of kind of a more complex piece that I think that we have time to talk about tonight. It's those 3 levels of traffic calming. You would, if we put in, for example, if we put in temporary speed bumps and they seem to work, then we would move on to install permanent speed bumps. Or if they didn't work, we would send it back to the process. So that's kind of the high level look at that, but I don't think we have time to focus on that necessarily this evening. So I'm just going to move on. Which brings me to our feedback questions. So the first one concerns there's background. In the original traffic calming program from 2003, there are these 7 objectives that live in there. And basically, we want to know your feedback on whether they all should be there. If some of them should be taken out, is there something that's missing? Should we be, weighting them, using them in the screening process? We basically just want to hear your thoughts on what these 7 elements are, and take your feedback on those. So I'll go through them one by one here. Well, I'll just read through them. So slower speeds for motor vehicles to create safer streets. Reduction of collision frequency and severity to create safer streets. Increased safety and perception of safety for non-motorized users of the streets. Preferences and requirements of the people using the area, working, playing, residing along the streets or at intersections. Reduction in the need for police enforcement. Enhanced environment to create more attractive streets, including the negative effect of motor vehicles on the environment. And increased access for all modes of transportation to promote pedestrian, cycle, and transit use. So I'll go back to these questions. I'll open up the floor.
I guess I'll get started. I mean, when I'm looking at these, I feel like they can be consolidated, or not, maybe not even consolidated, but like, to me, it reads, goals and objectives here. Like, the goal is to reduce the speeds of motor vehicles, and the measurables, I guess, is that you're gonna have reduction in collision frequency and severity. You're gonna have increased safety and perception of safety, and you're gonna have the reduction in need for police enforcement, because people are gonna be feeling like they need to slow down on the streets. And then the other major aspect is the preferences and requirements of people using the area. And within that, I think you can fold in the measurables of that, folded of like enhanced street environment, and then there's also increased access for all modes of transport. So I think that kind of system of like, it can be consolidated. Because a lot of these do say like basically those 2 things.
Yeah.
Do all of the things that they're doing for traffic calming, do they all solely have the effect of reducing speed, or are there other things they're doing to like reduce collisions?
That's a good question. So I think the current policy, I think as I described before, really focuses on speeds. We also want to encourage traffic volume reduction as well. I think that's isn't.
Yes. I guess where I'm going, so I agree with what Julian's saying, with maybe the one exception of, I don't think that's, my understanding at least, speed was not the only way they were trying to reduce collisions. It was one of the ways. And so I don't know that it quite goes so far as to say like program objective is, or the goal is slower speed, and then you measure it with these things, you have these other objectives. Maybe I see more like the top level is improve safety. And then there's these ways to do that. And then second to that is the preferences and requirements of the people using the area. And then maybe third to that is these additional benefits, increase access for all modes of transportation and all that. And it's not that I think that that's not important. It's, you do go down to that, like, are you going to put it above safety? No. Right. So are you going to put it above the preferences of the people? Well, the whole point of this program is about preferences of people. So it seems like it sort of has to be that. But I do think, yeah, we absolutely could shrink that down, and sometimes just focusing on a few goals helps make better decisions.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, just the goal and the measurables, I think that's not really a big point on slower speeds, but reducing collision frequency or whatever, we can switch that up. That's what I'm at. But I think just that categorization matters.
Okay, so 4 and what was the next page? And 6. So I think to your point, I'm going to say something that maybe you won't agree with. I would almost argue that this program, the one that gets initiated by residents, the number 1 should be some kind of consolidation between 4 and 6, because everything else is a goal of all of our program. I mean, that's some part of our TIP, and our CIP we should be trying to create safer streets, better, for non-motorized, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all baked in. This program is all about bringing some power where they don't feel like they have it. And I haven't listened to council's discussions on it, but I'm sure it's a response to those individuals that are dealing with people speeding in front of their houses. So I would submit that if you're talking about this program, the most important objective is some kind of consolidation of 4 and 6, really all about the people that are asking for it. Otherwise, it should just be part of our like, enhancing of, our CIP and
Yep.
our TIA.
I might. I think, John and I talked about this, too. It's really important for us to make sure we underscore, the city's gonna take on projects that do these things.
Right.
Outside of traffic calming, program. So I think your point is well taken. And if we see that there is significant accident history, some sort of problem needs an engineering fix, we're not gonna wait to do the neighborhood study. We're gonna carve up a project, we're gonna put something together. Right away.
And that almost maybe could be like, in this plan initiation, because there could be something that was overlooked. And then it's like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't realize how important this was. So maybe there's like an off ramp that isn't project eliminated, which by the way, I don't really love that language. Maybe project doesn't move forward is a little more palatable, but project eliminated.
It's a buttons down.
Yeah.
It's like, they're.
But, the flip side is, potentially it becomes a city project that gets accelerated, based on, and that's that same maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway.
So that's very persuasive, so much so that I would almost then go further than what you're saying. Change what I said earlier, go further what you're saying and saying 4 is number 1. 6 is different than 4. 6 is not the preferences of the people using the area.
Right.
So
But
like,
it is about an enhanced environment.
it is, but
not
you're
for
right,
those people.
That this whole program is about that. So that should be sort of its own standalone above everything else.
Did I persuade you?
Yes, of course.
I'm so happy. See, that's what, this is not just me persuading you, but us persuading each other has like always been my goal, like. Being able to talk to each
Part
other.
of the using the area working, does that mean like people are driving, this is kind of a catch-all, talking about driving through and residing there, those are two conflicting.
Yeah.
As opposed to groups that are. I'm not sure what working there means.
It's a bit of a laundry list.
That is.
It's the most
It is.
effective laundry
Or
list.
some of the like catch-all should need to be in there, that's what we're supposed to do for everything anyway. I think, I would think that, if you do something, you're gonna reduce the collision angle, so that's gonna be safety and the perception of safety. People might think that the street's more dangerous than it actually is.
Right.
It's kind of education. Lower speed's gonna be a result of doing something, so, I kind of lean towards, 6 in a way. But you're saying that 6 might be more like a project anyway to change speed, add sidewalks. So if you're back, 4, but kind of maybe works within the working. Basically for the people who are residing and using the street that might be in a pedestrian mode, want to feel in a safer, or it's a safe street for them to walk or live on. I'm not sure where I ended up with that, but.
That's good. All right, I'm gonna move on, I think in the interest of time. Okay, so the next one is this. This is about the petition itself. So the petition idea came from the consultant. I really like it, just kind of as a transportation professional and someone who's, worked in equity and, all of those pieces. My questions are, is a petition process the most equitable? It's certainly, I think, more equitable than what we have now, which is lady 1 says, I don't like this and submits it. And then, are there any other submission mediums we should consider other than a petition?
My concern with the petition is if you have a neighborhood where there's like a lot of diversity in language spoken, be a barrier to try and get 50% of the households. So it almost seems like picking any one method is gonna be a problem.
And I'll add on to that with my campaign experience. I mean, like, there's no way that you're gonna get 50%. I mean, even if you know that, I mean, well, that assumes that you have privilege in that neighborhood, which is what we want to avoid, picking projects that aren't privileged neighborhoods. And so assuming that you have 50% of households on the street that are in your apartment block, they're gonna answer the door, spend like 5 minutes with you looking at this complaint, right? And then signing the petition. I think that's very ambitious.
Yes.
That's just gonna block out a whole lot of people.
It's gonna pay.
It's gonna favor the privilege.
I mean, like neighborhood with an HOA, I mean, on my HOA board. If I have one, I could bring it to them and then we could all go around the neighborhood together and get it taken care of, right? It's not. Like, yes, our voices matter, but other people's do too, so. I'm not opposed to the petition. I think it's a good method. I think it just can't be the only one. I think you kind of have to think about who is not gonna be best served by the petition.
Absolutely.
Curious if there's a way to, like, I agree, if you have an existing neighborhood infrastructure like an HOA or some kind of community neighborhood board thing, like this would pair well with that, but for neighborhoods who don't have that, are more fragmented, et cetera. Like frankly, I don't know too many of my neighbors. I live in an apartment, we see each other every day, but I don't know too many names, right? Is there a way to use like the Find It, Fix It app or something where it's which is normally like citizens telling city staff like, hey, I see this pothole, whatever. Is there a way to almost like reverse that where it's like, hey, you've been selected for like, you know, like someone in your neighborhood brought this up. Yes or no, agree, disagree, comments. I don't know if like that's now that's labor intensive. That just puts the time and labor onto the city instead of the community.
Sure.
I don't know if that's what we want or we're looking for.
That's a good point.
If that's also some of the problems that we're getting at.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to just mention, because we have been thinking about this very question of equity and, you know, petition, you know, if you're English second language, you know, getting a petition from your presumably white neighbors can probably be tough, possibly. One idea that we had specifically related to apartments is kind of adding a way to, because apartments are notoriously hard to get survey responses from anyway. Allowing apartments to add to that number of responses and not count against you for the number of apartments you don't get. And I think I was going to bring this up in a couple of sections here. So that's one thing that we've been thinking about, but
It's interesting also the thing about apartments and the households, and you know, you look at one street, and if you have 5 houses on it or one apartment that has 20 people, does it make sense to say 50%? Let's just say petitions per permit. Does it actually make sense to even say 50%? Because if you got 10 of the apartment people, 3 of the house people, who's gonna benefit more? 10 people are gonna benefit more. Versus 3. So I'm not even sure like the 50% will make sense unless you figure out some way to handle the difference in density.
yes, especially as theoretically density is going to go up over time here too.
So you have 50% of the residential parcels instead of households?
And then apartment complex to get one.
Then they would,
Who decides?
Yeah, that is.
So then, like, you have a residential street, and you have 10 houses, you invite people to sign it, and they're both looking for a speed bump. You know, apartment complex, you know, 50 people up.
get
You get
25 of them,
people
it's
to
really
sign. I mean,
hard.
that's the inequity as far as finding same treatment.
Exactly.
So maybe we should look at what, like how often you have one person. If you're getting 100 petitions a day with one person, what if you up the number to 3, right? 3 people. You just gotta find 3 people in the area, right? Like, how high do you even have to go to make this be a number that is actually workable? And why go any higher than that? Like, why raise the bar beyond what the system can handle?
Sure.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, I think because they don't want they don't want people opposed to it.
Plan initiation. I think you deal with that at the the next
That's
phase,
a good
which
point.
I have, has its own problems, but it's plan initiation. I mean, if the system can handle hearing that many ideas, just raise the bar just to that point.
That's a very good point, especially because you said you hadn't even gotten any to step two anyway.
Right.
I would like to say it's already 7:50. What I'd like to do is, I would submit that I think what you're hearing from us is that we're concerned about equity and we don't think the petition process by itself is equitable.
Yes.
I don't think that we should be tasked with trying to come up with the answer.
Mhm.
And so we could spin around and try to find that answer, but I think our time is better spent figuring out what else that you need
Okay.
to.
Yeah.
Because I just don't think that we're the people to come up with the new method.
You have an equity for it.
So I want to jump to 3, because I'm just going to give a response that's very similar to what I just gave. The question you asked about, is 50% response attainable in all situations? I would say it's the same thought process behind that answer, which is how much funding does the city have for this? I assume they've said, hey, we're going to try and spend about this much, or thinking about this. So how high of a response rate do you need? Like, if nothing's gone past, if you set the bar at 20%, do you run out of budget? If you set the bar at 25%, right? Just put the bar where you need to be able to spend the money you have. That way you're actually making improvements. But don't set it artificially high or artificially low and then get a bunch that you can't work on.
Sure.
I'll note that, it's not exactly equal, obviously, but it's gonna be less, clearly, like the response rate for this is gonna be less, but in last year's local elections, basically only voting precincts in Issaquah that passed that 50% threshold, people turning in their ballots, was in Providence.
Excellent.
Yeah, and so that's the only place where 50% was exceeded. And so, I mean, this will obviously have a way less voting, response than else. And so 50% is just not gonna be attainable at all.
Yeah.
And so I think, the rest of this, Ruskin County was 37% last year. And so I'm not sure how much was specifically in Issaquah, but yeah, I mean, I would probably say like 20% is probably more reasonable or something like that. But,
Well, let's talk about 3 real quick. I'll go back to the other one in a second. So the question that we had for this entire section 3 was literally, do we need section 3? Because, there was going to be support here in section 1, and then are we going to get support again in section 2? I wonder if I should reverse the question and ask, do we need the threshold in section 1 and then focus on getting to specific amounts of support in section 3? Does that, I'm kind of conflating.
Yes,
the
I
two.
think that makes sense. I mean, if you're going to ask, would you like to improve this street? You're going to get a very different response than, you would like to do this on your street.
Mhm.
And that goes back to my whole point. If the system can handle the applications, well, I have the threshold any higher than that for just introducing the idea. What you're really trying to filter is this issue of, 1, how much budget you have, and 2, not doing something and then paying not to do it.
Right.
So it seems like it needs to have not just support, but it needs to be balanced against people opposing it. So it's more important to have the composition of respondents to be high than it is to have the coverage of all the respondents. Because what you're looking for is to try to ferret out any major active opposition. Right? Because you don't want to undo
To
it.
some degree, although you have the if you base your decisions on like bike lanes around people voicing opinion for it and then opinion against it, you always go, we should do it. And then if you were to find a way to get everyone's input, you might get a different thing, because you're always going to have people that are wanting a change are always going to be more vocal and more interested in voicing their opinion about change. So I agree it should be balanced, but I don't think it should just be like a up down. That's why there should be maybe some sort of do you actually have enough people that support this? I don't know how to set that threshold, but just So what if you have 1 and 1? You have 2 and 1, and you have a street with 50 people on it. Do you do it? Do you make a change?
You have
So you have
And
a
you
have a part-
engagement of three
apartment
people.
complex, yeah, and you have 3 people, and you have 2 that say, yes, let's do it. There's 100 people in the apartment complex. One says no. I wouldn't spend the money there, right? I would want, so I think there's some factor of like, you gotta have enough, but you also don't wanna have, as you pointed out, the bar so high that you're never gonna get that turning.
So get for balance.
Yeah, there's some factor there.
Okay. This is all really, really helpful. I really appreciate all your input.
And this is your project, right?
It is my project.
You can-
Yes. Yes, it is all mine.
Is this going how you thought it would?
Better, actually, so this is good. I want to go back to this one real quick. This is regard to the first come, first serve model. I'm thinking, we had some public comment around TIP recently, talking about, we have this stack of different projects, and sometimes we get a grant for this one, so we take it out and put it on top. So I'm sort of thinking about it from that point of view. So I'll ask, are there ever cases in which projects should not be first come, first serve? Because as it's written right now, as we're thinking about it right now, it is literally first come, first serve. But I wanted to ask the question.
I mean, I'm not sure, but I would say like when it comes to prior plans, right? And if you're talking about projects or something that people have been trying to do and it's already been put vaguely some plan, perhaps it could be like incentivized that way, jump up a few spots in the queue. I mean, I think it should be that first come, first served queue, but perhaps there could be something that jumps projects up in case they've ever been mentioned in the past, some kind of plan. I don't know how to think about it that way.
I think that off-ramp discussion we had earlier, those are the ones that should be prioritized, but because they should be done not just for the reason of neighborhood interest. So if we're talking just the scope of neighborhood interest, is there anything better than first come, first serve that doesn't result in this just turning into the rest of the projects?
So if there's first come, first serve, but there's some way to safety or some other reason to bump something up.
Up, it's off ramping into a city
want to-
project.
Sure.
Keep the
Becomes a
projects that are
different type of
driven by
project.
this, in this, and do it first come, first serve.
I'm kind of inclined to agree with
And that does kind of get back to what Emily mentioned is, if we see something that needs to be addressed, we are going to address it.
that. That's part of the off ramp. You can get off ramp and get killed, or you can get off ramp and get accelerated.
Take it out back,
Wow.
you can, yeah.
I'm gonna agree with all this. I also, this isn't a question you're asking, but I just, as long as like there's robust communication happening where like if something's changing where this is in the file, whether or not it's because something happens and that bumps it up in the queue or suddenly we got this grant, just like as long as like the neighborhood and the petitioner like knows that is
Yes.
also my concern as well.
Yeah.
So that, yeah.
Waitlist estimation.
Yeah, like restaurants or something.
Yeah,
Just get-
it's in the queue. Okay, great. Those are all my questions. Are there any other comments on any of them? Before we move on? Yeah.
How long, like with this new draft, from start to finish? Controlling for other factors like, right, the crash happens and now it's a big focus, like, what is like the end-to-end timeline that you would estimate for this?
I was hoping no one would ask this question
I'm so
because we're
sorry.
still working. No, it's just really humorous to me. We aren't exactly sure, but we want to design it, and that's why we're asking these questions. We want to design it in a way that feels like things are happening and it's not like thrown into the 6-year TIP and, you get a speed bump 6 years later. We don't want that. But we also want to balance, like we have a certain amount of resources. Currently, traffic calming sort of has a budget. It's shared in other areas that tend to be spoken for. So that's also a factor that we're gonna have to work through and, I imagine request during the process, hey, can we have a budget and see if that happens? So you're right. I think there's a myriad of factors that'll run into all of this. But we don't know, but we don't want it to be 6 years or 10 years. We want it to be much shorter.
Just goes back to the communication of like having
Mhm.
people like make sure that they've got the reasonable expectation that like it's not gonna go in the 6 year, but it's also not gonna be within the year.
Right.
Depending on what it is.
Sure, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay, just sounds like we're done with that topic. All right, good job. That's 4B, and we're on to 5, and we have reports. Do we have a update on the board work plan?
Yes, so the first thing I'll mention is next month's tab for May, we've decided to go ahead and cancel. So you get it off. Because we don't have anything specifically to share next month, but more importantly, we have Public Works Week events coming up. And so we're also all inviting you. Hey, how's that work with quorum? Anyway, we're inviting you.
It doesn't.
Great.
You show up as a resident of Issaquah.
So that evening, that tab normally would be the fourth Wednesday, the 22nd from 4 to 6:30. We're going to be having festivities up at Public Works related to just basically inviting the public in and see how things work behind the scenes.
Where would that be?
At the Public Works facility. I don't know what the address is off the top of my head.
71st.
It's,
Yeah, right next to Lakeside. Gravel.
Yes, right next to the gravel pit.
Where are the utilities?
She has a list, activity list.
Do you get to turn them?
Interesting.
I've been waiting for that. No.
It's a little bit more.
You can autograph the snow plow. We'll have some cool stuff. We're putting it together. No, there will be no driving on heavy equipment.
Mailbox.
But there will be lots of cool stuff. We're gonna have our CCTV van in operation to show how we have the camera technology to look down a pipe. So you will see that. See what's underground below the hydrant.
Use those.
We're gonna have, I think, a with our bobcats, John Deere's. We have a whole lot of those.
Just like
high schools
and stuff like that.
Oh, Bob. Oh, I thought we They like that.
What else?
We're going, please go, they're petting bobcats.
Yeah. Just all sorts of compliments for Micah.
Animals.
Awesome.
Any other?
I was just looking at the work plan. Last I heard, I believe that the Squash Mountain Non-Motorized Improvement Project will be coming up in June at our next meeting. I think we'll have it ready. Possibly concurrency. John was I'm not sure if they'll be ready-ish on that. And then same with Black Nugget Road, that might also be ready, but I'll have to touch base with Jim between now and then. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we'll hope.
Cool. So hopefully Squawk and Black Nugget for June. Big hills. And that's all I have for board work plan.
Do you have a staff report?
Besides cancellation of next month's meeting, no. Oh, wait, actually, that's not true. So we have new members coming aboard that would have otherwise started in May, but will be starting in June. Adam is one of them. He's here observing. We have one other person as well coming aboard. So we have two. Lemire. Lemire's going to be a full member. Cynthia's back. Jerry is not coming back, and she wasn't able to make it tonight because of other things. So she sends her love, and she loved being on tab, and she hopes to be back in retirement, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, so we'll have a good full group again in the new year.
Great, that was your separate, I'm gonna cross this out, that was on part of my chair report, is welcome the 2 new members.
You can welcome them as well.
Welcome, Adam. And also just remind you all that you're gonna choose a new chair and vice chair in June, and will not be running for chair again. And you can nominate in real time, but if you are not nominating yourself, I would suggest you contact the person you're thinking of nominating, make sure they'll accept the nomination. And if anybody has any questions about what's involved, it's just what you would think it is. Not a whole lot of extra time, but it's a little bit of extra time. That's really all I had. And I was just gonna mention Jerry, that was, yeah, she was originally gonna reapply, then she decided to withdraw her application. So we will miss her. And with that, moves us to the youth report. We don't have our youth member in attendance. I'm assuming we don't have a youth report. And that brings us to 6. Any other business or announcements? Any other
That's questions. What is Dave's resignation effect? Like, do we have like another court opening now, or he did that in advance of his term cycling up?
He didn't.
He didn't. This was the first I had heard of it, both of us.
Yeah. Which,
I would assume that we would ask the mayor's office to promote Adam from alternate to full, but I need to talk about that formally.
and unless it's an unusual year, they don't usually have many cycle applications. It's just too much.
Avi was special because we wanted to get a youth and we had interest.
And there was others in the city. There was
Yeah, I think.
several in the city. Yeah.
Economic development had somebody to, yeah.
So it's typically not, yeah, we don't have that. And especially now that, and if Adam does end up technically, he's either gonna technically move up or he'll move up every single time there's a small meeting,
That's true.
every
That's
time he
true.
comes in the door. But it means we have a full board, we just don't have alternates. Which is, we've had times where we didn't have a full board, so, and we've had the reverse, we had full alternates. But I think that puts us in really good shape for quorum every time, so. Haven't had any trouble meeting a quorum in quite some time, so that's great.
So almost today.
Until what?
Almost today.
Oh,
There's one person here. at the-
oh, right, because of the time, yes, that was, yeah. Being on time, that's a different question. Okay, well, if there's no other business or announcements, then I call the meeting adjourned.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
You're printing these out, that was helpful. I'm gonna give this to you and, do you want to put this in the minutes?
Yes.